Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with the 7 ontological arguments for the existence of God. Today we're going to be looking at objections to the conceptual ontological argument for the existence of God. If you're unfamiliar with this argument, you might want to check out my previous video on the argument itself. But if you're pretty confident with it, or you just want to watch this video, follow me and let's get started. So, the conceptual argument went as follows. I can conceive of a being of which no greater can be conceived. If such a being does not exist, then I can conceive of a greater being, one that exists. I cannot conceive of a being greater than one of which no greater can be conceived. And finally, therefore, such a being, God, exists. In this video, we're going to take a look at objections to the first two premises, and then we're going to take a look at objections to the argument as a whole and the validity of getting the conclusion from these premises. Let's get started. So, the first premise, I can conceive of a being of which no greater can be conceived. This premise is often kind of accepted on faith and generally understood to be, well, of course you can conceive of such a thing. I'm not so sure about that. I'm pretty skeptical of it, in fact. I would say, really? Can you? How big is it? What color is this being of which no greater can be conceived? What does it smell like? What shape is it? What's it made of? What does it look like? For me to conceive of things, I don't know about you, I have to get kind of a picture of them in my head. And if you're talking about a guy in flowing white robes and a big furry beard, then that's what you're talking about. But I don't think a being of which no greater can be conceived is really going to be that description. You're talking about something very different. You're not talking about an actual physical form out there. You haven't really explained to me what I'm picturing, so I don't understand how I could possibly conceive of such a thing. It's very concerning to me. I don't even think a lot of theists can conceive of or understand it. I think a lot of them talk about wanting to understand God more deeply. They can't really conceive of what he would even be. To give an example, imagine that Terry Pratchett and C.S. Lewis, two people who have wonderful imaginations and could imagine most anything, are walking down the street together. Lord knows why. And Terry Pratchett says to C.S. Lewis, I'm imagining a magical creature known as a Benedict Cindersnatch. C.S. Lewis asks him, what does it look like? Well, it's about 6 feet tall, wears a scarf and a peacoat, has a pointy face, brown hair, blue eyes, and solves crimes. This should give C.S. Lewis all the information he needs to perfectly picture this magical, mystical creature that Terry Pratchett is talking about. However, were they to be walking down the street and C.S. Lewis to say, I'm imagining a magical creature known as a Galloway. Terry Pratchett might ask the question, what does it look like? C.S. Lewis would respond, it is everywhere, it is all-powerful, it is all-good, and it's all-knowing. Sure, you've given us information about this creature, but you haven't answered the question. Yes, what does it look like? What is it like? What can I do in my head to imagine such a thing? You've listed properties, but you haven't explained to me what I need to do to recognize this thing if I saw it. It seems concerning, and it seems that, based on this information, I cannot conceive of such a being. I'm confused. I can't picture it in my head. Moving on to the second premise. So, if such a being does not exist, then I can conceive of a greater being, one that exists. This is very similar to a premise we saw in the definitional argument. I offered one objection there. I'm going to offer a different objection here. So, we can say that 9 is greater than 2. But are 9 books on fire that exist greater than the idea of the number 9? I'm not so sure. I don't think much is greater than books on fire in general, and also I don't think that things in the world are necessarily greater than things in our heads or things in our imaginations. Take, for example, the idea of a triangle. If you draw a triangle in reality, you're not going to draw it perfectly. No matter how much machinery you use, you are not going to get a perfect triangle. The lines are going to be a little bit wiggly, and they're not going to be perfect angles. However, if you imagine a triangle, you could imagine a perfect triangle. Therefore, it seems that the thing in your imagination is actually more perfect than the thing in reality. It's a little similar, and I don't want to get into this too much, to Plato's idea of the forms. Basically, that there are perfect conceptions out there kind of in our minds that are the perfect versions of things, and the reflections or refractions of those forms are what we see in the world. But by grasping those forms and the truths about those forms, we're able to understand deep truths about the nature of reality. Like I said, it's not a perfect comparison. The basic idea is it seems that in some cases, the things that we imagine are in fact greater than the things that we have in reality. Like I said, I'm going to skip objecting to premise number 3 because it seems fairly unimportant and insignificant, and move on to the conclusion and getting to the conclusion. There's a big problem that this argument has that I haven't touched on yet. So, in the first premise, I can conceive of a being of which no greater can be conceived. There are two different understandings I can have of what this means. Either I can understand it as something like Jerry believes in Santa Claus. In this case, we have no ontological commitment, no commitment to something exists. We can hold this to be true without claiming that Santa exists. Jerry can believe things that aren't true. He's allowed to, and that statement's still allowed to be true. We could also understand that in terms of Jerry is thinking about Santa Claus. In this case, we are actually ontologically committed to that thing existing, that Santa Claus thing existing. If Santa Claus doesn't exist, this statement, Jerry is thinking about Santa Claus, cannot be true. Just as the statement, Jerry is throwing the ball, can't be true if the ball doesn't exist. The first is going to be a statement that gives cancellation. That means it kind of can cancel out our ontological commitment. Whereas the second statement is going to be one that does not give cancellation. It can't cancel out our ontological commitment. We are forcibly committed to the idea that Santa Claus exists if we believe that statement. Okay? So, the idea of God can either be understood in a sense that gives cancellation or one that does not give cancellation. I'm sorry if we're getting a little complicated here, but this is the standard objection. So, if we understand this in terms of it giving cancellation, so X believes in God, that first premise we understand that we're talking about someone believes in something like God, but we're not committing to that actually existing yet. Then the argument is just patently invalid. Why? Because you can't jump in and out of intentional states. And yes, that's intention with an S, not with a T. I'll do a video on the difference later. Basically, Bill believes that the morning star is Venus. The morning star is, in fact, the evening star. Therefore, Bill believes that the evening star is Venus. Let's take a step back. When I say intentional state, I'm talking about states like X believes that blank. So, right now we have two of our statements are intentional. Bill believes that blank. The morning star is Venus, and Bill believes that the evening star is Venus. The question is, can we from 1 and 2 conclude 3? No, we can't. Why? Because 2 is not an intentional state as well. 2 is a normal statement. The morning star is the evening star. And it might not be the case that 3, that Bill believes that the evening star is Venus, if Bill, in fact, doesn't know 2. If Bill thinks that the morning star and the evening star are two separate things. So we can't jump in and out of these intentional states. If we start with X believes in God and we end with God exists, somehow we've jumped out of that intentional state and we're not allowed to do that. Let's take a look at another example. So, George believes that Windex will cure all ills. George believes that Elaine has a zit on her forehead. Therefore, Windex will cure Elaine's zit. Should be pretty clear, in the conclusion, we jumped out of the intentional state of George believes. If we had have left it in that intentional form of George believes that, therefore, Windex will cure Elaine's zit, that would have been a valid conclusion. That would have been a valid argument. The problem is we jumped out of that intentional state, and so it is invalid. Okay? For the same reason, we can't have an argument that starts with I believe or I conceive of a God in this sense that gives cancellation and end with a conclusion that says it exists without that qualifier, without that intentional state around it. Whew. Okay, the other way we can understand it is in a sense that does not give cancellation. This is X thinks about God. The problem here is this simply begs the question against the atheist, as it simply assumes that God exists. If you don't accept that statement already, that first premise, there's no way you're going to want to accept the conclusion. Something like John is thinking about a unicorn. John cannot be thinking about things that don't exist. So, a unicorn exists. Clearly, unless we are already accepting in that first premise, inside that first premise, we have to understand that if we accept that as true, we are accepting that unicorns exist. If we don't accept that, then we don't accept the conclusion. Similarly, Wilfred is thinking of a number that is both odd and even. If Wilfred is thinking about it, it must exist. That's just included in that first premise. We don't notice it yet, however. Therefore, there is a number that is both odd and even. Once again, begging the question. I'll get more into kind of this problem and this fallacy with these kinds of arguments when we move on to the modal ontological argument next. Finally, I'm going to leave you with a quote from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy that really sums up all the ideas I kind of had in this last argument against this claim. On the one hand, on the reading which gives cancellation, we learned about that, the inference to the conclusion that there is a being than which no greater can be conceived is plainly invalid. On the other hand, on the reading in which there is no cancellation, it is clear that this claim is one which no reasonable, etc., non-theist would accept. If you doubt that there is a being than which no greater can be conceived, then, of course, you doubt whether you can have thoughts about such a being. If you didn't understand that, it's just a summary of kind of that last argument that I offered. Whew. That was Objections to the Conceptual Ontological Argument. Next week, we are going to do the very popular Modal Ontological Argument for the existence of God, followed by the Meinonian Argument, the Mariological Argument, the Religious Experience Argument, and finally the Higher Order Argument. Wow. Watch this video and more at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.